Yo, what's up? Hope everybody's doing okay. If you saw the title of the video, your initial thought is probably like, how did this doofus win a challenge? I don't know. That's what we're going to hopefully figure out today. So, if you did see the title, then you will know we won a challenge with Dimirror FrogTide. And I wanted to do a nice little breakdown of the video, breakdown of the deck, show the gameplay, answer questions, hopefully get ahead of some other questions, blah, 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 blah. Either way, we're going to run down all the matches here so you can show or see what the deck is like. We'll talk sideboarding. We'll talk a little bit of gameplay. As always, if you like the video, if you end up liking the commentary, feel free to leave a like or subscribe to the channel. Greatly helps. Otherwise, down below, I'll have links to the deck list. I'll have links to the Discord if you want to come talk about it. Twitter, first place it gets updated when we have a live stream. The Twitch link, in case you want to actually check out that live stream, which is always fun. We have a good time. I'll also have a link to my matchup and sideboard guide video for this deck. So it's a nice little 2-hour video that goes over a brief synopsis of 15 of the most popular matchups in Modern, plus sideboarding tips. So if you're wondering how to sideboard for your next RCQ, hopefully that helps you out. But let's go ahead and jump into the meat and potatoes of this video, which is Dimirror FrogTide. First off, we'll go over the deck list that we got up on screen. This is what I ran through the event yesterday. Some notable inclusions, exclusions. In the land base, you'll see there are no copies of Gloomlake Verge. It's still a card that's in the testing process for me. I didn't feel confident enough with it yet, so I didn't register it. But as we're going back through the video, I'm going to be keeping a tally. I don't know. Dark Slick. That was supposed to say Gloom Lake. I started off like Doom Lake and then swapped it. And yeah, just trust that it says Gloom Lake. But I'm going to be going through and tallying every time Dark Slick Shores was better, Gloom Lake would have been better, or it didn't matter. And we'll kind of get into the specifics of what that looks like when situations start popping up. In the counterspell slot here, we got 4 counterspell, 3 force, 3 spell snare, 3 spell pierce. You might see 3 force negation, 3 spell pierce, and be like, oh my god, that's a lot of non-creature counters. The purpose is a tempo positive counter against the One Ring, so spell pierce. Force negation to help answer static prisons on your frogs, or answer Trinispheres against Tron. There's some unfair birthing ritual stuff running around. There's always funky decks like that. So having a little extra interaction. Also stopping Goblin Bombardment on the draw is really important. Chthonian Nightmare on the draw. So I think having a couple extra of those cheap non-creature counters has been really nice for me. 2 Harbinger of the Seas, 4 Murktide, 4 Bowmaster, 4 Psychic Frog. Spoiler, I'm still not a big fan of 4 Murktide Regent. I could end up seeing cutting a 4th Murktide and a Spell Pierce for a couple Consider. Maybe not Thought Scour. I think that's a little too deep in the sauce for me. But we'll see how it plays out. 1 Toxic Deluge in the main, mostly respecting the Boros energy matchup. 2 Shoot the Sheriff, 4 Fatal Push, a Cling to Dust, 4 Preordain. A lot of the stereotypical removal. People see Shoot the Sheriff when I'm playing and say, oh, aren't you the go for the third guy? In paper, yes, because I haven't picked up my Shoot the Sheriffs yet. Online, Shoot the Sheriff because I've got them. And I do think they're the better option as far as your 2-mana removal goes. In the sideboard, a 3rd copy of Harbinger of the Seas, mostly for Amulet Titan, Tron, 3 Mystical Disputes, 3 Stern Scolding. This is a meta call for the challenges. I'm expecting a lot of Murktide variants, maybe with or without Oculus, and I'm expecting a lot of Boros and Mardu energy. And Stern Scolding being great against Boros and Mardu, Mystical Dispute being great against the Mirror. That's the reason for going up to the 3rd copy of both of those. 3 consign to memory, a second copy of Toxic Deluge, 2 break the ice, mostly for Tron, 2 Nihil Spellbomb. In previous iterations, I've been on like Spellbomb, a couple Surgical, Hearse, something like that. I still like Surgical in some spots. And I definitely like Hearse against the Dimirror, but I think Nihil Spellbomb's kind of like a nice in-between option that kind of tanks Flage, as well as being able to pop it early for a redraw and stop Flage from potentially coming back by just getting rid of graveyard resources. I did see people in one of the Discords commenting on Surgical and like why I bring in Surgical for the One Ring. And when I say this list was for this event, I still think Surgical is decent against cards like the One Ring. And you have to understand the reasoning behind it. And that is a card like the One Ring, if it resolves, you lose the game a lot of the times. Unless you have your opponent like locked out with a Harbinger and they literally can't do anything. If you don't, you lose the game. I feel like against decks like Boros, the One Ring is so prevalent that I can win the game more often than not if they don't resolve a One Ring. So countering the first One Ring is great and all, but a lot of times if they find a second one, the game's over. I don't care about other top decks. I care about the ring. So Surgicaling the ring takes that out of the equation. Now I only bring in Surgical if my opponent has like backup options that I'm okay Surgicaling, if not the One Ring. So against like Boros, you can hit the One Ring, you can hit Flage. Both are very solid options to Surgical. Against decks like Tron, I can hit the One Ring. I'm also okay Surgicaling Kozilek's Command. These are cards that I feel beat me if they resolve. So taking them out of the equation is fine. It's not a matter of trying to like limit their top decks by taking out one of their 15 options. It's no, I'm saying I lose to this one specific card. Let me stop from having to worry about it. And people say, this is another half of that argument. People say, oh, you Surgical the Flage. Well, what if they just never draw a second Flage and you went down a Surgical? That's fine. I was winning that game regardless because they weren't drawing another Flage. But now I have compounded that by saying you can't draw another Flage. Either way, it's my reasoning for it. If you don't like it, you don't have to do it. Nobody's holding a metaphorical knife to you and saying like you gotta board in Surgical every chance. But let's get into the matches so you can see how they actually play out instead of just sitting here listening to me yammering about one kind of niche sideboard slot. Like whenever I do any sort of gameplay video, you always have to take it with a grain of salt. These are like my decisions that I made in real time. You don't have to make the same decisions. It's fine. Just go enjoy your not having a modern challenge trophy. What's that TikTok trend like? All right, on the play, game number 1. We've got a Swamp and a Sink into Stupor. We do have a counter spell, but I'm going to end up keeping it because it's got a Frog on the play, and I think that's very important. I will say, on the blind, game 1, unknown opponent, try to be proactive. You could mulligan aggressively for like double blue and counterspell or whatnot, and that's great. But if you end up against a matchup where that just doesn't matter, then you kind of put yourself at a pretty big disadvantage. But if I've got a situation like this where I've got a turn 2 Frog and I'm on the play and there's a chance my opponent can't just answer the Frog and it runs away with it, I'm going to keep this hand more often than not. Lead on the swamp in case they're a creature deck. Like, it could shut off my ability to double blue for counterspell on turn 2. Or it does shut off. But at the end of the day, like, I'm jamming Frog on the play in the blind. So I'm going to make them have an answer for it. Thundering Falls, Meticulous Archive. Makes me assume some sort of Jeskai control deck. Off the bat, number 1, Dark Slick Shores, looking worse than Gloomlake here. So we'll put a tally in the Gloomlake column. Being able to Bowmaster and hold up Counterspell would be really, really nice against any sort of control variant. So, game 1, turn 4, first tick for Gloomlake. So, we find out they're a dress down variant. Flage, probably Nulldrifter, maybe Solitude, who knows. Fling to Dust finds us a fetch land, so we know we're able to fetch on our turn, get Revolt, kill off the Flage, have double Counterspell back up. And yeah, we're just going to keep chunking in with the Frog. Then it goes for 1 ring, we counter, they counter, we counter. Hope they don't have a force negation to end it. I guess I can't have a force on their turn. I've been prepping for Legacy some, and I keep thinking of Force of Will all the time. So, Flage comes back, shoots us in the face. That's cool. We're gonna pew it. They could have a counterspell, but if they do, I just get to untap with like a really big attacking Frog. They're the dress down. I could ditch like 4 cards and put them down to like 3. It's worth it to me. We'll just go to game number 2. Up a game against Jeskai, Nulldrifter. Sideboarding. I kept it pretty light. I kept in a Harbinger because they are a 3-color deck. There's a chance maybe I see a Harbinger and it kind of shuts down what they got going on. Otherwise, just boarded in Mystical Disputes and Nihil Spell Bombs. And boarded out like a few Fatal Pushes and a Harbinger and something else that I thought didn't really matter. But our entire game plan against them is just like deal with the yard so they can't get back Flage over and over. And then hopefully deal with like dress down so they can't just stick a big threat. Gotta remember that all their threats sacrifice themselves if they don't have a dress down out. So fighting over the dress down can often leave a lot of the other stuff just kind of falling away. Now they do have consigned to memory, so you got to keep some sort of tabs on that one as well. But consign by itself against us just like isn't a very good card. They can consign a Frog trigger if they want to, but like, hey, we get to keep our Frog around. Spell Snare. We're going to let the Mystical Dispute resolve instead of spell piercing it, so that if my opponent follows up with a 1 ring, we could spell pierce the ring instead of being stuck with another Spell Snare in hand. In this case, I go for Teferi. Pretty okay dealing with that one as well. So, Teferi off the board. Solitude our Frog. Little Unforge. Mystical Dispute's alright. Gives us an answer to something like the 1 ring. We could try to counter the Nulldrifter, but I'm just going to hold up the Dispute. If they go for a consign, we can dispute that. Set the yard, take our redraw. I do think it's important to recognize times where you can just sack Spellbomb to replace itself. All right, this is one of these times that I've got Mystical Dispute. I could try to counter the Solitude, and I think that's reasonable. but I feel like if my opponent untaps and resolves a One Ring, I just lose. So I'm okay losing my Murktide, keeping Bowmaster, keeping Mystical Dispute up, so I can interact with the One Ring. Like, the One Ring is just that impactful of a Magic card that more often than not, I'm okay like losing some ground to respect the One Ring if I feel like it is the only thing that beats me. And more often than not, when I'm playing against some of these control shells, that's how I feel about the card. It's like, this is the thing. Well, Sink into Stupor the Teferi. I honestly expected them to replay it, and then I realized they didn't have another like blue or white mana, so they couldn't replay it. Then Top Deck Harbinger Seas is just like chef's kiss here, because we lock them out of red, or we lock them out of white mana, low on red, so they can't get back Flage. Same thing as earlier. We Mystical Dispute, hold up in case they have the consigned to memory. Now, if they replicated it, not much you can do about that. Opponent going for the EOT Solitude. I don't know why they didn't just go to their turn to do that. I guess they wanted to play around like counter force negation or something. But I could have paid for counter force. Either way, let the Harbinger go because we've got Mystical Dispute to fight over this Flage. If they ended up having like an extra blue to counter spell, we could spell snare back. Preordain into Preordain, into Sink into Stupor. Just, again, respecting the One Ring more than anything. I don't care about Teferi here, but I do care about my opponent playing a One Ring. See that? See it? You see it being put back in hand and us winning the game? So, nice little 1-0 start over Jeskai control. Round 2. Bit of a sketcher. So, I've seen my opponent's name on Storm before. So, that's kind of where I'm assuming here. And on the draw with a Force Negation, a Frog, a Counter Spell, a Spell Snare, Force Pitch Fuel. Like, this is a really good hand if I hit my second land and they don't have turn 2 Ral. So, Thundering Falls, flip over a Ruby Medallion is indeed Storm. Undercity flips over a Murktide, so a lot of pressure on that second land. Now, unfortunately, they do have the Ral. We're going to jam this Psychic Frog here. I could hold up Spell Snare, Counterspell Force, or whatever. But if my opponent has the means of going off through more than just, like, Force, then they're probably winning this game anyway. And if they don't, then hopefully I can just hit, like, some decent payoff. Force the Morph. The Pyretic Ritual, go for another Reckless Impulse, and whiff. So, good spot for us. I do think this is them kind of punting away this game by blocking this Frog. I feel like you don't block that Frog in a million years. Just go to your turn with your mana advantage. Like, make me have the removal spell for the Ral and spend it. Not playing out this Swamp because it doesn't help anything in my hand. So I'd rather just use it as Frog Fuel. In this case, I can ditch the Swamp and the Toxic Deluge, get my opponent down to a 1-turn clock, double Spell Snare up in case they go for 2 rituals or something. And really great to steal that game 1. So they are on like a blue-red version of Storm with Flame of Anor. I don't want to over sideboard too much. I think I just end up like boarding out an extra Harbinger, boarding out Shoot the Sheriffs, maybe a Fatal Push, bringing in Consigned to Memory for Storm Trigger and for the Ruby Medallion. Bring in a couple Nihil Spell Bombs. I'm usually not a big fan of Grave Hate against Storm. Like, I should have jammed Frog here. Two thoughts. One, I'm not a big fan of Grave Hate against Storm. Most of the games, like, yeah, Past in Flames exist, but most games come down to your opponent not being able to compile enough resources in one turn for Past in Flames to matter. Then the Frog here. My opponent played Valakut Stoneforge as their third land, so I should be assuming they don't have a fourth in hand, which means if I jam Frog and we go off the rule of 2, which is the vast majority of their spells that matter, cost 2 mana, and I've got Spell Snare, I can, like, Pierce a Ritual or Spell Snare, a Ral, or something like that, and essentially time walk my opponent, go back to my turn with a Frog up. But I was kind of afraid of double spelling, so I passed with Counterspell plus something, thinking they would play their fourth land. Maybe I counter like a Ral, and then they have a Ritual to follow it up, and I got to counter that too to not die. But because it was the Valakut Stoneforge, I should have made that assumption they don't have another land and play out the Psychic Frog. And turns out we would have been right. Letting the Flame go because it's not going after my Frog. Not letting the Ral go. Alright. Bowmaster doesn't matter. Ditch that. You might think this is a really good situation to be in. They're locked down to 1 mana. I've got Counterspell. I got Force Negation. You remember how in game 1 my opponent punted? This is my turn to return the favor. They put a Ruby Medallion on the stack. I should never, 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 never in a million years counter this Ruby Medallion. Why? Because they're down to 1 red mana, which means they get 1 spell per turn. 1. May it be a Ritual to try to get more red mana, a Manamorphose, a single like Ral, or a Reckless Impulse effect, whatever the case may be. 1 spell. I've got essentially 2 time walks here with Counterspell and Force Negation for whatever their one thing is. But instead, I, like an idiot, fire off Counterspell on this Ruby Medallion. Now I've got to fight over a Ritual or Manamorphose in this case to try to keep them off extra red. Untap, find a Murktide, push, it doesn't matter because I can't cast it. Cast the Murktide, but just get severely punished on their turn by, them having all the red mana in the world that I could have stopped if I had just gone with my 1 Counterspell and their 1 red spell per turn. Just didn't. That's on me. I could have even just like spell pierced the Ruby Medallion to try to make them pay, but I just didn't. I don't know why I didn't. I thought about it like as soon as I went to my turn, like, there's just no reason whatsoever to counter that Ruby Medallion. I think I just kind of rushed because I had Frog and 3 counters in hand. It was like, just counter whatever. Just time walk. And I didn't think about Ruby Medallion being a really bad whatever target. On me. I take that L. Opponent getting Commercial District early means they more than likely have a Veil of Summer in their hand. So we're just trying to pick a spot where we can like counter spell plus spell pierce. Hey look, a Veil of Summer. Trying to use the spell pierce first in case they didn't have the Veil. Either way, we got a Murktide, we got a Counterspell. Let them resolve like some Rin's resolves and things. Let them resolve a Rin's resolve. Another tick for Gloom Lake here. So, if this was a Gloom Lake, I could hold up like my double push plus Counterspell plus play Spellbomb. The second push probably doesn't matter that much, but what does matter is Nihil Spellbomb, crack the Spellbomb, draw a card, Fatal Push, Counterspell. 5 mana I need. But Dark Slick coming in tapped means I do not have access to all of those things. And some people will argue like, oh, you don't need all of those things right now, so it doesn't matter that it's Dark Slick instead of Gloom Lake. But I think having options, all options on the table and available to you, is one of the most important things you can do in a game of Magic. Okay, this was a kind of funny turn cycle. So, end of my opponent's turn there. I've got a 7/7 Murktide. Spellbomb just drew me into a Murktide of my own. I could go for like Fatal Push my own Murktide a couple times or one time. Really 2 times. To try to set up, draw a non-land spell. Like draw an instant or sorcery. Cast it. Hold priority. Counterspell my own spell. And then resolve Murktide, exiling 4 instants or sorceries, making this first Murktide lethal. That's an option. I probably should have fired off the first Fatal Push, just going for that. Like the off chance that maybe it works out. But decided not to. Drew into the Polluted Delta, which means if I fetch up an Undercity Sewers and I saw an instant or sorcery in the yard, I would now be 1 mana short of push, counterspell my own push, Murktide, kill them. So if I had cast that Fatal Push into turn and then untapped, drew a fetch land, surveilled over an instant or sorcery, I could have killed him with the second Murktide. But it's got a really funny turn here of Ritual, Rin's Resolve, Ritual Reckless, and finally they find a Ral and try to go to like flip the Ral, but we're just going to Fatal Push it and counter the Manamorphose, call it a day, untap, and have lethal on our turn. On to round number 3, I think. Unknown opponent. We're on the draw with the Psychic Frog. Again, being proactive in the blind. Spell Snare on the draw. Really good target. Temple Garden into Island. I have no idea what they're doing. I don't think I want to back up Spell Snare because they didn't really play into the first one. Ah. Living End. Titanoth Rex. So Frog can potentially like ditch a Murktide or something in the face of an actual Living End. Go for Harbinger here because my opponent's representing Force of Negation. So I'm kind of thinking if I play out Harbinger, maybe I have a chance to just like lock them off of green. They didn't have a land cycler turn 1. So who knows? Maybe they don't have one. Harbinger can just kind of shut off the game. I could hold up Counterspell instead. But if my opponent just like doesn't do anything, Counterspell looks a lot worse. They go for Sync on my Frog. So I assume they've got like a Living End in hand. We'll ditch a couple of these Murktides just so we have something to bring back if they do go for it. They don't, so now the immediate thought is, okay, they've got Subtlety. So attack in, plan on counterspelling the Subtlety. Opponent waits till end of turn. So now I guess their game plan is to race the Harbinger because they had Subtlety and Force Negation. They could have just flashed in and blocked. But they probably figure, okay, you got a dead Frog in hand. Got a dead Frog in hand. Can outrace the Subtlety. Or outrace the Harbinger. Little do they know, my Frog's not dead because I have basic Swamp off the top. Easy. Streamer luck. Just wasn't streaming. Play out my frog. Threaten to hop the frog, stand in front of a subtlety. There was that deluge. There's probably a world where it's fine to take the deluge and just like wrath away the subtlety and the curator and outgrow with my psychic frog. I don't think that's the worst play in the world. Like, you lose your Harbinger, but you just have a big frog, and if at any point they living in, you're getting back like triple Murktide, another frog, a Harbinger, and if they don't get rid of your stuff, if they don't living in, then you just have like 4 or 5 frog beating them in the face. But opponents just got more subtleties than we can possibly count. Ditch some cards to eat one of them. So they're down to 1 card. We've got a Murktide, which we are going to play out. Keeping all of our dudes in the yard. They'll Pierce a tad late. Not that this game has really gone in a way that plays to it. Press the enemy is another bounce effect they get access to. But them blocking with the subtlety kind of means they have living end. Unfortunately, I'm assuming they had Ardent Plea in hand and happened to top deck the Sink into Stupor. So they needed a critical mass of bounce effects for it to matter. We get back double Frog, double Murktide. I started having this thought here of like, okay, if I attack with double Murktide and they like just gang block one of them, then I could exile like my spells in the yard and get in a chunk of damage there. Maybe like get in for take out a subtlety or take out a curator, pass the turn. My opponent attacks back. I've got like double frog chump blocking, or I play out the Harbinger and I've got triple chump blockers. Maybe block like Waker, jump a frog, block something else, block a couple off the Rex, go to 1. Something like that. And I get in a little bit of chip damage. So maybe if I attack out, they make poor blocks and they attack back. Maybe I can survive at like 1 or something and have a Murktide left over that may be able to find me lethal. So we go for the chump attack and they say no blocks. Why they say no blocks, I could not tell you. But we're going to discard our hand, exile everything to put 4 1/1 counters on both of our Murktides, which makes this attack exactly lethal. Gotta respect the Merc Father. As soon as I saw no blocks, I was just like, huge eye status. This is game 2 against Living End. Boarding out a bunch of removal. Boarding in Mystical Disputes, Nihil Spellbomb. That seems to be the consensus in like all these matches. Is board in Mystical Dispute, Nihil Spellbomb. And Consign to Memory because it hits Cascade triggers. Playing out Nihil Spellbomb here instead of the Frog so that I can have Consign and Force up. I got by Living In the other day really badly where I was in this exact same scenario. Had a Frog, had a Nihil Spellbomb, had a Force, and I played out the Frog thinking like, okay, I forced their Living In on their turn, untap, jump the Frog and draw a card, and I feel really good, replay the Spellbomb, whatever. And I passed the turn, my opponent went for a Living End, I forced a negation, and they commandeered my force negation. I was like, how much interaction do you have for this godforsaken deck? And apparently the answer is all of it. You have to have every piece of interaction known to man. So we have to force negation the Teferi. Play out the Frog because I've got Consign and Nihil Spellbomb. I really need to draw cards. And Consign the Cascade trigger. So now we are hopefully not good, but hopefully okay. Dark Slick I don't think really matters here. I'm not casting it, and I've got my 3 mana available anyway. Now this was an interesting decision point. I was thinking about it earlier. Like, I don't want to fire off my Nihil Spellbomb because then Living End resolves, they get rid of my Frog, and I have nothing else going on. So I'd rather counter the Living End. Pretty straightforward. If they've got a Force of Negation, then I've got the Spellbomb as like the backup, but it's not really what I want to be doing this turn. No, they have Flare of Denial. So I could have stopped it by like fatal pushing the Shardless Agent, but I don't think this is a line anybody is ever playing around. Maybe Flare of Denial is stock and Living In now. I don't know. I wasn't playing around it, nor was I ever planning on playing around it. Still counting this as neutral for Dark Slick. Doesn't really matter. I can't fatal push anything without Revolt. And them playing out Otawara means I'm assuming they've got like a subtlety in hand or something like that. Murktide's a really good draw. We'll cast Murktide. They do indeed have the subtlety, but we've got Mystical Dispute. But they've got second subtlety. They're like hobbits around here. Like, if you've had first subtlety, but have you had second subtlety? No, nor do I want it. So that fatal push, the no value fatal push on the Shardless Agent is just to get the 7th card available to be able to Murktide. Attack in here means they've got another Living End. There's the Shardless Agent. Wait. You're telling me that you flipped over 40 cards and did not hit another Living End. So their hand right now is more than likely just 2 Living Ends and a Dream. We've got Sink into Stupor for this Curator of Mysteries. They can't kill us on the ground fast enough. Murktide gets in for the W. Bet you didn't see that one coming. On to round number 4 and our newfound nemesis, Noob. On energy. We keep a hand. It's a little slow on the draw with a tapped Undercity Sewers, but I do have a Spell Snare for a 2-drop. You're probably seeing a theme here with a lot of these opening hands, with me like naturally drawing the Undercity Sewers a lot. And trust me, I know this theme better than everybody. So jam out the Frog, hopefully dodge a Static Prison. Got 3rd Guide, Aether Hub, Discharge. So if we're talking about ways to kill the Frog, that's probably one of the few ways the Discharge could, if I didn't, or if I allowed it to. Just being able to go all in there. Do find a fatal push for the guide, so we can slow the clock down a little bit as long as they don't have a follow-up. Maybe they windmill slam a 1 ring and we get like Bowmaster double counterspell or double Bowmaster plus counterspell. I could have shocked in the Watery Grave there. Really, I should have to have Bowmaster plus counterspell. But I'm kind of thinking, oh, they didn't have the ring last turn. Maybe their hand is just like a bunch of discharges and static prisons and stuff. And I can save this counterspell and like a couple points of life. Another point in favor of Gloomlake there. That Dark Slick would allow me to counterspell Bowmaster plus Cling if it were Gloomlake. So we are 3-0 in the Gloomlake count right now. Altsy's away my counterspell for Giganta. We Cling to see if we can find another counterspell. Don't. So this is one of those times that's always frustrating against a deck like Energy, where you Cling into a land, draw a land for turn, escape Cling for another land. Your opponent hits a Raptor to make some extra energy and get to fly over your blockers. So, c'est la vie. C'est la vie, c'est la vie. Sideboarding against Energy. I could make a 4-day long video of sideboarding based on feel against Energy. Some of the key takeaways. I think Harbinger is better against Mardu than Boros. I think that's kind of straightforward. Like, the more greedy mana base, Harbinger's better. Bowmaster, I think, can be a trap a lot of the times. It kills Ocelot Pride on the play as a 1 for... or 2 for... 1.5 for 1, something like that. On the draw, I think Bowmasters is pretty terrible. I boarded them out here, which I know seems really weird, but because I'm on the play, I really want to be proactive with like Frogs and Murktides, and Bowmaster's cool, but it just plays into a bunch of cheap things that I don't really care about on the play. Because my opponent plays a turn 1 Ocelot and I've got like a turn 2 Frog, I don't care about the Ocelot. It's not killing Guide, it's not killing a Johnny, and I've got like Toxic Deluge in anyway. And I'm really on this camp that like I don't think Bowmaster is good against us. So I don't want to keep in Bowmaster just for the sake of hitting opposing Bowmasters. I'm higher on it against Boros because they could have Ragavan. They're more likely to have 4 copies of the 1 ring. They don't have Bowmaster to kill your Bowmaster. But against Mardu, I'm a bit lower on it. Like, the game's just not won and lost on the ground. The game is won and lost in the air with Frogs and Murktides. So Guide doing its best impression of a really annoying Magic card. The Dark Slick here, putting it in the doesn't matter category because I couldn't cast everything anyway. You might think we're in a bad spot. I think we've got our opponent right where we want them. Because now they're locked out of red mana. So all we got to do is stop Static Prison. Guide of Souls is fine. It's not flying. It's not outgrowing the Harbinger. As long as they don't find basic Mountain, they're kind of limited to 1 spell a turn, which Counterspell plays really well into. And this 1 ring is going to kill them in a couple turns. So we just need them to not have another copy of 1 ring. The extra spell snare doesn't matter, so I'm going to bend that. Find a Murktide Regent to jam out another big threat. But the extra, like I said, the extra energy or life here doesn't really matter. If they have another One Ring, I can't do anything about it with the spell snare anyway, so I might as well just counter the Ajani. On to game 3. On the draw, I don't think my sideboarding changes, like, at all. Dress away my Deluge. We'll put this as a point for Dark Slick Shores. I don't think I end up, or I do end up Fatal pushing here. So yeah, actual point for Dark Slick. I was going to say, if I ended up Spell Piercing or like Spell Snaring or something, then it wouldn't matter as much. I had the Polluted Delta, so I could go get a Watery Grave if I wanted Dark Slick to be able to make all my colors, but being able to get this Undercity Sewers and filter a little bit is a whole lot better than having to force myself into getting a Watery Grave on turn 1 that I may or may not actually need. Take a hit off the cat so we can hold up Counterspell or Spell Pierce. I will say this is me being a little bit scared of Boros and needing to respect Mardu less. Last turn, I had the option to just jam like a 7/7 Murktide or play a Frog. I should have done one of those instead of holding up Pierce and Counterspell. The fact is, Mardu does have substantially less interaction than Boros does, where Boros is like 4 static prisons, 4 bolts, 4 discharge. Mardu, a lot of the time, is like 2 static prison, 4 discharge or something. And my opponent's got no energy. So just jamming a Murktide and like making them have the static prison right now, I think is a bit better than trying to play timid and like taking an extra attack, taking an extra flage ETB, just to try to go to the like next turn and hold up a counter spell. Like, make them have the answer right now, and if they don't, then this snowballs really, really quickly. Because I would have Murktide attacking here. I'd have Psychic Frog on the battlefield already, which means I wouldn't care about that Thoughtseize in the slightest. Like, they just take an extra counter spell, and now I'd be hitting with a Murktide for lethal this turn if they didn't have interaction, which it appears they don't have a copy of Static Prison, or they probably would have maybe gone for it plus Flage. Like to try to eat through counter spells. Now I need a way to exile stuff from my yard, which we miss out on. So we can't attack. We got to just chill with our Murktide. Try to counterspell a Flage. And yeah. We Spell Pierce to try to make them tap off of Flage mana. Unfortunately, they do have the extra land, and it's an Arena of Glory. So they're able to haste up a Flage and kill us. And we do get punished for not just jamming that threat a turn sooner. I think jamming the Murktide, that turn I had the 2 open mana. The Murktide specifically, so that I didn't get into a Frog discard scenario. Like, they had to have exactly Static Prison, and if they're only running 2 copies, say, there's a really good chance that that Murktide just like survives and runs away with the game. So this is round number 5. Opponent leads off with a Dark Slick Shore, Preordain, very mindful, very Dimirror, Thoughtseize, very calculated, very Dimirror, very mindful. I've got a theory in the Dimirror mirror where I think the person that uses their Undercity Sewers first loses more often than not. And my kind of thought process on that is, if you use your Undercity Sewers aggressively early, point for Gloom Lake here. 2 things. First off, point for Gloom Lake, because if this were a Gloom Lake instead of a Dark Slick Shores, and I didn't want the untapped mana next turn, I could play out the Polluted Delta here for just this scenario, being able to fetch up a basic swamp, Fatal Push the Harbinger, instead of having to use a Sink into Stupor on it, because I've got Bowmaster and Fatal Push that I need the basic swamp for. If this Dark Slick were a Gloom Lake, then I could have the 4th untapped land next turn with Bowmaster and Murktide, while still keeping the Sink into Stupor in hand. But because it is this this Dark Slick, and I wanted the 4 untapped mana next turn, I got to play the Dark Slick out this turn, which means I'm about to get cut off of black if I don't Sink, and I can't really afford that. So yeah, point Gloom Lake for 1 on the count. As our opponent's resolving this Harbinger, I'll finish up my thought on the Undercity Sewers. I feel like if you're using Undercity Sewers early, you're probably just searching for like a generic thing. Like, oh, I need lands. Let me crack my Undercity Sewer. I need a threat. Whatever the threat is, let me crack and find my Undercity Sewers. But I think the card is way more valuable when it comes to searching for specific things. Like, okay, I need exactly a Murktide. Or better yet, I need to find a counter spell to protect my frog. I need to find a Sink into Stupor or a Shoot the Sheriff to deal with an opposing Murktide, something like that. And I think the person who uses their Undercity later has a better chance of kind of filtering into the things they need, as opposed to the person who uses it early, not really knowing if the thing they're trying to get is what they need to win the game. So here, we Fatal Push on their upkeep so we can fight over Counterspell without worrying about Force Negation. Unfortunately, they have a follow-up Murktide that is bigger than our Murktide, which is not what we want to see. So we got to take a hit. But if we had our Undercity still, we could potentially fetch to try to filter into that Shoot the Sheriff. Thankfully, we find it. So just like last turn, we're going to Shoot the Sheriff on their upkeep. Hope they don't have an answer. Okay. Pause the video. Go think to yourself for a minute what your line of thinking here is. And I'll tell you what I thought and what I realized. My thought here is if my opponent has a counterspell for my Force Negation, I lose. No matter what I do. Unless I just let this resolve and go to my turn with hoping to top deck another Shoot the Sheriff. Really narrow. Probably not happening. And if they have a counterspell, then they get to counterspell that Shoot the Sheriff, and I probably lose anyway. But if the opponent has counterspell for my Force here, I lose the game. Easy enough. I can hardcast the Force, fetch up a basic island off the Polluted Delta, another Watery Grave off the Mire, hardcast the Force. They got the counterspell, they got the counterspell. If I Force pitch Spell Pierce and they got the counterspell, they got the counterspell. Doesn't matter. The level 0 play here is hardcast the Force because the Spell Pierce is dead. Doesn't matter if I hardcast the spell or the Force or pitch the Spell Pierce. I'm still losing to them counterspelling my counter. What I realized after this match, when I went back and watched over during the gameplay recording, was there is a non-zero difference between hard casting the Force and pitching the Spell Pierce. And I don't mean just the life loss. Because I still believe you have to fight over this counterspell. The card I wasn't thinking of was that Sink into Stupor. So if I had Force pitched the Spell Pierce and my opponent had to sink it to super. In this case, they synced my Shoot the Sheriff. If they had synced the Shoot the Sheriff, I could have recast it. If they synced the Force of Negation, I can fetch Shock and hard cast it still. And I'm at, like, nothing lost. I ditched the Spell Pierce, but the Spell Pierce doesn't matter when my opponent's got 5 lands out. So I had a card in my opponent's deck that I could play around by force pitching the Spell Pierce and just didn't think about it. So ended up losing that one, but that was a really good learning moment of, hey, this card exists. I can play around it by doing this thing. Sideboarding into the mirror. Mystical Dispute coming in. I've got a couple Spell Pierces coming out. I usually board out like a Force, maybe a Bowmaster, because, again, I don't think Bowmaster is good in the mirror. I think it's kind of a trap card. As always, you're welcome to disagree, but I think it's like cool for trying. I think the person that respects Bowmaster usually ends up losing to Bowmaster, which is kind of funny because it feels kind of backwards. Like, hey, you respected this flash card that pings you and you draw cards and whatnot, when in reality, it's just not a card that impacts the game that much. Like, ooh, hit you for 2 here. I still had to answer the frog. If you had the frog living, you're probably still attacking regardless of the Bowmaster. Cracking the Spell Bomb in response to the fetch here. They could have just hard cast a Murktide if they had one to start the turn. But because they went for the fetch, I'm cracking the Spell Bomb to keep them from having Murktide plus Counterspell. I think is pretty important. It turns out my play was a little bit rewarded here because they do end up having a Murktide to ditch to the frog. So this is what I mean about Bowmaster not being that impactful. Like, my opponent's at 12. They're still flying over with the frog and attacking into the Bowmaster. Just like, you're not wasting a bunch of resources on it. Back. Find a Murktide. Really nice draw there since we can protect it with like Counterspell and Force or whatnot. Opponent scoops up to the Murktide. Another thought I had on the Dimirror is, hear me out. What do you think? Terrible hand, chunk it, 1 land, reasonable hand. What do you think about taking the draw in the Dimirror? My thought process is there's nothing they do on turn 1 that you care about. Turn 2 is like Psychic Frog turn, but you've got Spell Snare, Fatal Push, Mystical Dispute that all answer the frog. So you've got like a fairly good critical mass of on the draw answers to a turn 2 frog. But the extra card can be very impactful in a matchup like this when it comes down to like counter wars or hitting land drops, stuff like that. So I think I'm going to give it a shot next time. It's probably worse against like the Oculus builds to take the draw, but in just these OG FrogTide mirrors, I kind of think taking the draw might be the play. Just trying to find another land drop. Remember when I said Undercity Sewer is getting used early? Fight over a frog. It's like that Undercity, there's nothing specific that you're looking for. I was looking specifically for a land, but our opponents got their lands. Maybe they were looking for a piece of removal or something. Here I was F6'd. So first off, I don't think Graveyard Trespasser is necessarily a modern playable card. Obviously, it looks good if your opponent's tapped out and missing land drops and you get to resolve it, but otherwise, I'd be sitting here with Counterspell. When I say I F6'd, I mean I thought my opponent cast the Graveyard Trespasser and then cast the Cling. I thought they had already played their land drop, so I just auto-passed through the end of turn. After they Cling, they played a Swamp, Bloodchief's Thirst, my Frog here. If I was not F6'd, I should have discarded a Murktide and probably a Mystical Dispute to be able to cast this other Murktide out as a 5/5. But I just didn't because I thought they had already made their land drop. By the time they got around to the Swamp Bloodchief's Thirst, it was too late to take off auto pass. But either way, we get to Stern Scolding a Frog, Mystical Dispute a follow-up Murktide. So my only thought here is, please, for the name of all things just and holy, give me a fetch land so I can get down a Murktide and stand in the way of this Graveyard Glutton. Yes, that is the actual name of this magic card. Play Spell Bomb so they don't get to flip back over. They end up exiling a Murktide out of their own yard to be able to, like, drain a life. I don't really like that play. I think they're better off just attacking in, exiling stuff out of my yard to keep me off Murktide Regent. But hey, at the end of the day, if you're registering Graveyard Glutton, you're making choices. Fetch land, still probably the best draw in our deck. So we can get our other Undercity Sewers. We can get Revolt for this Fatal Push. Now you might be thinking to yourself, Michael, why did you take a Bowmaster? Bowmaster is not that great in this spot. And you would be right. I bottomed both of those Bowmasters. I saw Preordain and drew the third. So it was just 3 Bowmasters in a row right there. Opponent's got 3 cards. Turns out one of them is a Sink into Stupor, which is fine. I've got Bowmaster to chump block the Graveyard Glutton. Now I found a Polluted Delta, so I've got Fatal Push up. Turns out that their hand is just a whole mess of Fatal Pushes, so we get the Glutton off the board. We get the Fatal Pushes out of hand. They're down to 1 unknown card. I should play out Murktide here. I should absolutely just like Windmill Slam the Murktide, because that makes them have Counterspell right there, untap Murktide. And their Murktide would be bigger than my Murktide, but it's such a narrow like series of draws that they'd have to have. I think it's just kind of worth it. So opponent waits for my Frog trigger to go on the stack to cast their Bowmaster. I don't think this app actually plays around anything, but I've been wrong before, so I'm willing to be wrong again. Now, maybe I should have taken a page out of my own playbook and said, oh, well, opponent could hit triple Bowmaster in a row, and I get really punished for taking this attack. But thankfully they didn't. And I get to untap with the Murktide, hold up Counterspell. I really don't want to go down to 1 in the face of potentially another Bowmaster. So I am just going to like sit on my double Counterspell, try to call it a day. Like, it's going to take a lot for them to fight through double Counterspell when they're top decking. But Murktide plus Counterspell plus Force of Negation will, in fact, play through double Counterspell when you're top decking. Again, choosing not to go to 1, but I've got Fatal Push for their army token. They scoop it up because they're going to have to chump block my Murktide with their Murktide, in which case Frog gets into draw, and I've got Counterspell for whatever they top deck on their end. So, yay for us winning the Dimirror Mirror. On to round number 6. Sitting at 4-1. Looks like we're up against Zoo with Psychic Frog on the play. Toxic Deluge is one of our only outs to a resolved Scion of Draco with a Leyline out. But Frog gives us the ability to kind of attack in. Portico here means no Leyline Binding into turn. Leyline Binding on their turn means no Scion. No second land drop means we're just going to keep jamming Frogs until the cows come home. Because ultimately, if they find the second land and get a Scion, then them being able to take out, or them not being able to block Frog and us having Toxic Deluge to potentially take it out, is about the best thing we have going on. And since they didn't main phase another Leyline Binding, I'm assuming they don't have another one. But even if they do, this Spell Pierce kind of shuts that off pretty aggressively. Another point for Gloom Lake here, because if this Dark Slick Shores was a Gloom Lake, we could hold up Bowmaster plus shoot the Sheriff. Instead, we just have to hard cast this Harbinger and lock our opponent out of the game. Much less exciting. Not very mindful. Very not Dimir. Sideboarding against Zoo. You'll see I did board out a Harbinger. That's because on the draw, they're way more likely to be able to get their basics, especially if they have a Leyline of the Guild Pact. Just like a basic mountain kind of stops all the Harbinger shenanigans. Basic Plains does too, but boarding Consigned to Memory, mostly because it hits Scion of Draco on the draw, but it can also hit an ETB off a Leyline Binding, so it's got a little multi-use to it. Blage. Blage is good, I guess. So many Psychic Frogs. Like, Psychic Frog is a reasonable card to play out, but I'd rather have a Murktide down. I'm just trying to, like, aggressively use all of these instants so I can just play out double Murktide and, like, make them have Leyline Bindings. It's aggressively trying to kill our Murktide. We don't want that to happen. Sink into Stupor. I could play it out, play a Murktide, grow the old Murktide by 3, but decide instead to hold up Sink because there's such a good chance that they just go for Escape Flage this turn. And if I get to sink that, then I essentially time walk and have a good chance of, like, running away with this game. They're kind of showing that they don't have the ability to answer this Murktide. So dealing with Flage just kind of icing on the cake. The fact that they had the Arena of Glory was very unexpected, but still a nice little bonus. Deal with exerting that. Get down my second Murktide. GLHF. On to round number 7. The last round of the Swiss are winning into top 8. We're 8th seed going into this match. The cutoff was 2 undefeateds and then 6 X and 1s. So we were the last X and 1 as the 8th seed. If this were a paper event, you could just clean cut into top 8. Everybody draws, everybody moves on. Because it's not, because it's Magic Online and you got to play this round, it turns into 1 undefeated at the end of this round, 4 X and 1s. So there's 6 X and 1s going into the round. 3 of them win, 3 of them lose. And then the loser of the undefeated, 2 undefeateds. So 4 X and 1s, which leaves 3 spots left over for X and 2s to squeak in. more than likely, the people at the higher part of the rankings now, even if they lose, still make it into top 8 because your opponent match win percentage is going to get better because your opponent that just beat you is going to have a higher match win percentage than they had the round before. So kind of on average, that's going to rise, which means if you're already at the top of the standings of like the X1s or whatever, there's a really good chance you're going to be top of the standings after. So regardless, opponent leads on a Razortide bridge, so I'm assuming like Affinity or something, and then they go for Stoneforge. So I have no idea what they're doing, but I don't want Stoneforge to go get something scary like a Cauldra, so we're just going to Spell Snare that. Second Stoneforge, again, not really sure what's going on. Hoping Harbinger locking them out of white mana does something. Oh, Sword of the Meek. So it's Thopter Sword, which is, I guess, kind of cool. Like, it's a deck I haven't seen in quite a minute. We'll see if they can beat Harbinger into Murktide region. I don't know if they're a Saga deck. I don't know how important white mana is to them. At least I know they can't cast Thopter Foundry through this Harbinger. Important little piece of blocking information for my opponent here. If they knew this One Ring was in their hand, and that was their plan, was to find a land and play the One Ring, then blocking the Murktide last turn actually worked against them. If they had blocked the Harbinger and bounced off of it instead and taken 6 off the Murktide, they'd go down to 4. And then if they cast the One Ring and I counterspell, they can block the Harbinger this turn, take 2, go to 2, and get an extra draw step. But because they threw the Tamiyo under the Murktide the first time and took the 2 off the Harbinger, then they're going down to 8 with exactly 8 on board right now. So if my opponent ends up watching this and had the One Ring and knew that was like their out was to resolve the One Ring next turn, then blocking the Harbinger would have just given them a free extra draw step. Maybe it mattered, maybe it didn't matter, but just nice to know. Sideboarding, I ended up bringing in an IL Spellbomb, brought in Mystical Disputes and like some Consigns. Didn't really know what I wanted to do sideboard wise, but I figured Consign could hit ETB off like Stoneforge or Urza if they run Urza, which I'm assuming like all Thopter Sword decks do. Consign could, yeah, Consign hit ETB or random artifacts like this. Mystical Dispute for like Urza, for Metallic Rebuke. I really don't know like what I'm supposed to be playing around, so I just boarded in a bunch of like blue, white, colorless tempo cards and figured I'll maybe figure it out as the game goes on. Forge can resolve. They end up getting a Shadow Spear off that, but then we get to consign an ETB off a Portable Hole. I could have consigned the ETB off the Stoneforge, but because I have this double Fatal Push, I'd kind of rather rely on one of those. The Murktide on top, love that. Preordained finds a Force Negation. So I wasn't going to play the Murktide until I found the Force Negation, because if my opponent had a One Ring here, I didn't want them resolving that. I'd have to like bad mana leak the Mystical Dispute. But as soon as I found the Force Negation, it kind of became, okay, green light, play the Murktide, hold up Force. And if they don't do anything crazy, then I just get to untap with Dispute, Force, whatever. And that's kind of what happens here is opponent plays a Talisman and Shadow Spear. We say cool. They play a Nettle Cyst. We say cool. We got a bunch of big flying, attacking derps. Play the Fatal Push because I can't take it with me to sideboarding. Either way, that's all the Swiss rounds. We ended up 6-1 in the Swiss. Made it into top 8 as the 5th seed. Yeah, our Thopter Sword opponent, Zoo opponent, and our one loss, the Mardu Energy opponent, all made top 8 as well. So really good matchup spread for us. What did we play in the Swiss? We played Jeskai, Nulldrifter, Ruby Storm, Mardu Energy, Zoo, Thopter Sword, the Dimirror, and Living End. Like, that's a heck of a matchup spread. But on to top 8. Win the die roll. Looks like we're up against Energy. Now, I will say, top 8 on Moto is not the same as top 8 in paper. They have a die roll on Moto. So you don't just have like higher seed gets to go first or gets the choice. That absolutely made a huge difference in this top 8. I don't think the outcome would have been the same if this were in paper and the higher seed got to choose. But because I won the die roll and I get to do things like jam Frog early, even if they have interaction for it, it's definitely a lot more favored in my end. I was kind of thinking because they let on Bolt, maybe they didn't have another piece of interaction. And if they had had another Galvanic Discharge, I probably would have just jammed into it, like discarded, grown the Frog. But of course, they have the Static Prison. Opponent's got to be a meanie face. But got Fatal Pushes. We got Spell Pierce for a 1 ring. Like, we got some okay stuff. We'll get back the Frog next turn, potentially. It'll push the guide so they can't get some extra energy. Another guide. So many guides. And we rip a Harbinger off the top. Tried. Okay. Michael, why didn't you play the Harbinger here? The reason is I respect the 1 ring way too much. I say way too much. I feel like it is the card that wins the game if my opponent resolves it. So if I've got to take a turn off to like hold up Bowmaster, Spell Pierce for the 1 ring, maybe get my Frog back, whatever, and give myself a chance to see another 2 cards to hit a land to Harbinger plus Spell Pierce, that's a pretty big deal to me. It's not a perfect plan, but it's the one we got, so we're rolling with it. In this case, they amped Raptor, and actually, I think I'd show it here, but they flipped into a 1 ring, which I thought was super funny and super ironic. But they scoop after we bowman down the Raptor, which means we'd get in another attack with the Frogs. And we probably would slam the Harbinger that turn, even if we didn't hit the land. Mainly because we'd have the Bowmaster out. Ragavan. Against like the Boros builds, especially with Ragavan, I'm more likely to keep Bowmaster in post board. But I'm trying to get a feel of like how my opponent's playing around Harbinger, what their 1-drop situation is like, how impactful is Bowmaster actually going to be, how aggressively are they going after Frogs. It's a lot of just trying to figure out play patterns that my opponent is showcasing. I Surveil will shoot the Sheriff to the top. just so my opponent gets a dead hit off Ragavan. Force negation of the Blood Moon. I could play Sink into Stupor to hold up Counterspell, but like I am not letting my opponent get another attack in with Ragavan. I am casting this Bowmaster kind of regardless of what they do. Follow it up with an Ajani, but they do not have the ability to kill their own cat token. So maybe we can stop them from doing that. Parlor, flip Parlor. Use to block your cat token. This is one of the scenarios where like it's really nice to be playing FrogTide and not Shadow because I'm not down to 8 life or whatever, and I can afford to just let my opponent like jam in with this Cat Warrior token and not care about it. So I don't have to risk them flipping the Ajani till I'm ready for it to flip. Opponent tapping and untapping into turn makes it look like they have like a what's it called, Celestial Purge, but finding this Fatal Push, really good draw here, because now I can trade with the cat token, push the Ajani, and have Counterspell for whatever the follow-up is, and kind of clear off the board a bit to hopefully Windmill Slam a Murktide, which doesn't get hit with a Celestial Purge. Got Arena to haste up a Giganta. Doesn't really do much in the face of an 8/8 Murktide. So discharge away my Bowmaster is fine. Murktide, Frog. Give them more stuff that they got to deal with. Fortunately, the ring. So hoping our opponent draws pretty poorly. That's kind of our out if they just find static prisons for our dudes. And this is what I meant at the beginning of the video with Surgical for the One Ring. Like, if my opponent doesn't see a One Ring here, they do not win this game. Period. But if I Surgical the One Ring, then I don't even have to worry about this kind of scenario. Like, I don't even give them that out. But I've got this Fatal Push. I'm keeping an eye on my opponent's life total and their energy count. So with this Ocelot Pride resolving, they'd go up to 7 and 4 energy, which is not enough to Galvanic Discharge my Murktide. And it's not enough energy to survive an attack from the Murk. They don't have any hasty threats out, so I don't have to worry about them flying over. But I'm trying to keep this Nihil Spellbomb up as long as humanly possible. So if they go for a static prison, I can crack the spell bomb, draw a card, and potentially find a counter spell. But if I fatal push the guide too early, then I run the risk of them having a static prison. I crack the spell bomb, and I can't cast a counter spell because I'm down to just 1 mana left over after I draw. So keeping an eye on where my opponent's at, energy and life total wise. Now, since they're passing through their turn, I know I'm free to fatal push the Guide of Souls now, because the life doesn't matter, but the energy would give them 5, which would let them discharge down my Murktide. I don't want that to happen. We're past their second main phase, so they can no longer static prison if I tap off of Nihil Spellbomb sack. So we do fatal push the guide into turn here. They don't get the extra energy. They can't discharge. I would go ahead and crack the Nihil Spellbomb just for the extra draw. But since opponent scooped, we don't have to worry about that. That was game 2. We're on to match number 2 of top 8 against Napoleon, who is the only undefeated in the Swiss. Another point here for Dark Slick Shores, being untapped black or blue mana on turn 1. We had the Flooded Strand, so if we had Gloom Lake, we could get an untapped black or blue source at the cost of 3 life. But I really like keeping fetches in hand as long as possible in this matchup, so you can play around Blood Moon a little bit. Kill off a guide. Opponent taps off of all their red and white mana. So we're going to Windmill Slam this Harbinger and just coast to victory with double Harbinger. Love to see that. Yep. Opponent scoops it up. Really, really love when somebody doesn't respect Harbinger. I will say I think Harbinger has won like 3 or 4 games over the course of the event. And that's something that Dimirror in general has not had access to in recent years, is the ability to just like unfairly lock out your opponent, unfairly kill your opponent, whatever the case may be. Spell Pierce a Ghostly Vacuum. And it has no follow-up. We could just jam a Frog here, but I think I'm going to sit on Bowmaster. Potentially Cling to Dust just to draw another card. Get my basics in case of Blood Moon. Now, since they're missing land drops, I'm assuming they've got interaction, but we'll just start jamming threats. Make them deal with stuff. Went for the tapped Undercity Sewers here. I should have gone Flooded Strand for basic island and just played double Frog. Made them deal with both of those. I think giving them an extra draw was really unnecessary there. Like not making them have 2 red removal spells right there. And then, yeah, we play out the Murktide. So we are finally double jamming threats. I just think we did it like a turn later than we should have. Discard everything to the Frog. Make them have triple removal here. Which, this is kind of the deal you get with Boros. We see the double discharge and the static prison and the lightning bolt. This is why I'm a lot less likely to jam threats against Boros than I am against Mardu. But sometimes you got to do what you got to do. Sequencing here. So I looked at my opponent's graveyard and realized they had 4 cards besides Flage. So they couldn't escape Flage without another card in the yard. So I didn't have to Cling to Dust right away. But as soon as I got done with combat, I realized, oh, well, they can go to their turn and just sack the static prison and escape the Flage and kill the Frog. Like, they don't have to pay for the static prison. And I wouldn't have a priority opportunity to Cling to Dust in the face of that. So now I have to go ahead and Cling to Dust the Flage. So I missed out a couple points of damage on the Murktide by not clinging before combat, but I just didn't think I had to. And I can't target something else to draw a card because I risk them going sack the static prison, maybe find a fetch land for another parlor, surveil another card in the yard, and still be able to exile the Flage. So I have to exile the Flage itself. So opponent should be at 11 here. Like, again, should have Cling to Dusted a turn early. And unfortunately, that is a really big deal here. So punt on my part for not Cling to Dusting pre-combat. I just, again, didn't think that I had to. They do have the discharge here for the Murktide, so maybe it ended up not mattering. Probably ended up not mattering. Stern Scolding the Ajani, because I figured if they had another 1-drop, they would have played it first, like a Guide of Souls or something. And I wanted to have an out to Goblin Bombardment in case next turn they attacked with Giganta. I had to take it, and they just went with the Goblin Bombardment to sack and finish me off. Thankfully, Thraben Charm kind of bailed me out as something I could interact with. The attack here. So I feel like not attacking is the play to not lose line. It's not the play to win line. My best chance of winning is finding another threat while they're kind of dead on interaction, finding a shoot the sheriff for the elk or something. I could just cling to dust to gain some life or draw a card and chump block the Giganta, but I don't feel like that really changes my outs very much. Yeah. Basically seeing like the same amount of cards one way or the other. And wouldn't have got there regardless, because if I had gone the chump block, cling to dust, draw a card route, it would have found me the preordained, would have cast it the next turn, seen like Toxic Deluge land, bottom those, found another land. So on to game 3. The decisive one in this semi-final matchup. Keep a 1-lander on the play, but I do have a preordain, so just hoping to find more lands, which we do, thankfully. Got Spell Snare for turn 2, Cling to Dust to kind of fight over Flage or something. Eventually a Murktide. Just hoping to be able to Murktide and hold up Force. I think that's a big deciding factor in this matchup, is reasonably quick threat plus Force. Spell Snare the Ajani. Go for the Surveil land because I need to hit lands more than I need to find a counter spell. Nulldrifter, of course, hitting a Static Prison, so got to fight over that. But we did find a Fatal Push and a Stern Scolding. Funny little line here. So my opponent Ghost Vacuums, which I don't care about because anything they exile out of my yard grows the Murktide. It doesn't appear they have another Static Prison. And it doesn't appear that they're going to be able to kill my Murktide with a Galvanic Discharge. So it's like, I'm just going to Fatal Push the Ocelot Pride here. I didn't even think about Thraben Charm, but at the same time, I don't think my opponent thought about me being able to Nihil Spellbomb myself. So I get to draw a card, grow the Murktide, get the Thraben Charm out of hand, kill the Ocelot Pride. Like, everything that could possibly go right in that turn cycle kind of did. Go to their turn, attack in for a chunk. Shock in to play Shocking, a 1-ring. Decide to save the Bowmaster for whenever my opponent actually taps their 1-ring, so I can kind of machine gun down their board a little bit. I could have played it in response to the 1-ring, but I don't think that 1 damage to the face really matters. I think I'd rather just completely clear their board. Preordain finds a Spell Snare, so now we got an answer to things like Ajani and Ajani, Amped Raptor, Goblin Bombardment. Drawing into the Bowmaster, putting themselves down to 1 with another copy of the 1-ring, so kind of just prolonging their demise at this point. Can't draw with the ring. They have to deal with my 3 threats on board. Got into Flage pretty good. But again, kind of like the matchup before this, this is a lot of moving parts that don't actually kill my Murktide Regent. So I don't want to just fire off interaction for things that don't matter. Like, they still have to have a Discharge or a Static Prison. Discharge still doesn't kill my Murktide, so until they show me they can get enough energy to kill the Murk, I'm not interacting with just like a random Guide of Souls. But on to round number 10. The finals against our new good buddy Noob, our rival. Leading off on an Ajani on the play. But we do have a Frog plus a Force Negation. This is what I talked about in the matchup last time when I said I needed to do a better job of being more proactive, playing to the board more aggressively. So just like jamming Frog here, saying good luck, Godspeed. Opponent flips their Ajani to the Bowmaster, ping on the token. Kind of says, all right, I'm going to take up this Ajani, get it out of range of Frog. And we say, ha 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 ha, there is no such thing as out of range of the Frog. Like, my friend, you showed me that you didn't have a static prison last turn. So I'm going all in on this Frog. This is my life now. I've got force negation. So, like, it's up to you to stop this Frog. And I will absolutely be flying in, discarding, drawing cards, trying my absolute best to get this game over with as soon as possible. I am a Magic player who will admit when I'm wrong. I very much undervalued Frog in the Dimirror Shadow Shell. I do think it is substantially better in Murktide than it is in Shadow, but definitely underplayed the card a lot. Again, cracking in with the Frog, putting him on a 1-turn clock, hold up, double counterspell, and if it doesn't say kill the Frog or like put a big flying blocker into play, I do not care about it. Attack, sure, got it. Not blocking, don't care. Because now you got 2 more creatures on the ground you got to deal with. Galvanic Discharge your Ajani. Cool. Don't care. Doesn't kill me. Static Prison. Care. Care. Care very much. And then discard to be able to fly with the Frog. Attack him with a big lethal croak. And steal game number 1. Love to see that. Frog, absolute menace, absolute MVP. But I probably wouldn't have been so aggressive about the Frog against Boros, but against Mardu, knowing that now that they are so light on things like Static Prison, we jamming. So, game 2, on the draw. Keep a hand with a Fatal Push and a Stern Scolding. Ghost Vacuums, something. Card hadn't looked too impressive to me. I get it. Just like repeatable Grave Hate. And maybe you get to sack it at the end. But I don't know. Seems like it could be better. Thoughtseize away my Deluge. They're really, really sent on like nuking my graveyard. Bottom some stuff I don't need. Find my I'm on the draw, so I should have 2 Harbingers in. Usually keeping 2 in on the draw against Mardu, 1 in on the draw against, none in on the draw against Boros. 2 in on the draw against Mardu. Find a fetch for a black source, so I'm just going to jam Harbinger and, like, make you have the Static Prison, because you can't get a basic mountain off your Marsh Flats. Them adding Giganta into hand and not static prisoning my Harbinger is really, really good news for me. Now, I've got to... There's a fun little interaction here. So they've got this Ghost Vacuum, and they've got a Flage in their graveyard. So they can exile the Flage and then sack the Ghost Vacuum, get a 1/1 copy of the Flage that ETB kills my Harbinger, and I can't stop them from sacking the Ghost Vacuum. But what I can do is whenever they get ready to like exile the Flage, I can sink into Stupor the Ghost Vacuum and lose the ability to put the Flage back on the battlefield, and it's just exiled. You do have to keep in mind that if my opponent, like end of my turn, exiles Flage, goes to their turn, and puts the Ghost Vacuum ability on the stack, at that point, it's too late to sink into Stupor. They get the Flage. They get the last known information is, oh, I had a Flage under this. And they'll be able to get the copy there. So you have to make sure that you sink into Stupor when they don't have priority on their turn with a Flage. It does specify on there, like, activate only as a sorcery. So, again, I'm just buying my time with the sink into Stupor until they activate the Ghost Vacuum to try to get Flage back. I'm assuming they're trying to find like a 1 ring or something to double up. But find another Sink into Stupor that I can use when my opponent activates Ghost Vacuum, targeting the Flage, and then nuke their vacuum before they get it back. Very much a what's the word for it? Very underwhelming finals. Like, just sitting here waiting for Ghost Vacuum targeting the Flage. Picking up a counter spell is really great. Ping them for a little bit more. They didn't Ghost Vacuum. Now I'm starting to think my opponent just doesn't recognize that they can Ghost Vacuum their Flage and like get the ETB. All right, now they do. So we go for the Sink into Stupor, bounce the Vacuum. If they can't get that back, replay the Vacuum. That's fine. Don't care about that. And now I'm going to hit you for 2 and never tap off of this double counter spell to save my life. Very anticlimactic. That's the word I was looking for at the end there. Very anticlimactic finals game 2. Harbinger of the Seas, absolute all-star for the entire event. Like, the number of times that we played a little conservatively with the Harbinger and were rewarded by being able to just lock out our opponents was phenomenal. Frog was excellent. Bowmaster is still mid. I might try to find a replacement for Bowmaster in some of the upcoming leagues. Force was great. Pierce could have been better. Maybe try to find a replacement for that. If the energy decks are going down on like Chthonian Nightmare and Goblin Bombardment, then I think Spell Pierce is a lot less necessary. But if they end up going back up on those things, then I want the Spell Pierce back. Murktide, I still think there were a lot of times I saw multiple Mercs that I didn't want them. So probably going back to cutting the 4th Merc in favor of maybe just another draw spell. The Deluge in the main didn't matter. Shoot the Sheriff, Fatal Push were fine. Sideboard, never brought in Break the Ice the entire event. I guess that's kind of fine. Only brought in the extra Harbinger a couple times. So like the Harbinger probably doesn't matter. The Break the Ices, if you just want to make that a 4th consign, have a little more game against matchups where consign is good, and assume that you only want Break the Ice for Tron, then I think that's fine. Personally, I think Break the Ice is better than consign against Tron, so I really don't like leaving home without it, but it all depends on what you're expecting to see in whatever event you are playing in. Nihil Spellbomb was fine. If we're going to see more Murktide mirrors, especially Oculus matchups, then I want this Nihil Spellbomb to be unlicensed hearse instead. But if we're expecting a bunch of just Flage decks, then I think Nihil Spellbomb's a really, really good, really proactive sack nuke the board or nuke the yard effect. What else do I got? I think that's about it. Pretty straightforward event. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Maybe you learned something new. If you did, if you found out some piece of information, you thought about some line you didn't think about before, then please let me know in the comments down below. Always love hearing back from y'all so we can kind of relay information with other people watching the videos and hopefully elevate the community as a whole. Other than that, yeah, come hang out in the Discord. Come talk Shadow, or in this case, FrogTide. Love to hear from you. Other than that, yeah, hope everybody has a fantastic rest of your afternoon. Stay safe. Enjoy some good food and company. I will catch y'all back live later. Adios for now.